Hello and welcome to the second episode of Settling the Score, brought to you by the Alpha Zeta chapter of Kappa Kappa Psi. I'm Jackson McClellan. In this podcast, we guide you through a particular piece of wind ensemble music that you can hear live right here at Indiana University Jacobs School of Music. Today, we're looking at funeral music for Queen Mary, written by Henry Purcell and elaborated by Stephen Stuckey. This incredible piece will be performed by our own IU Wind Ensemble on November 7th, 2017, under the direction of Stephen W. Pratt. In part 1 of today's episode, you'll hear some background on the life of Henry Purcell and the creation of this piece. In part 2, we'll break down the structure of the piece, explaining the specific musical techniques that make it so compelling. And finally, in part 3, we'll sit down with the conductor himself and get an insider look at the performance. Henry Purcell was born in 1659 in London, England. After centuries of dominance by Spain and Portugal, England was rapidly rising as a world power, and London was a new cultural and economic hub for the European continent. The product of a very musical family, Purcell was active as a musician from early childhood. Purcell's father, also named Henry, died just 5 years after his son's birth, and young Henry was adopted by his uncle Thomas. Thomas Purcell was extremely supportive of young Henry, referring to him as his own son. Purcell rose quickly through the ranks of English music, becoming an apprentice to the royal organist at the age of 14. Throughout his life, he would work closely with the crown. Purcell began his prolific royal career composing Anglican sacred music for King Charles II. After Charles' death, a Catholic king ascended the throne, and Purcell, a devout Anglican, lost his ability to write sacred music for the royalty. During this time, he turned to other genres, embracing opera, chamber music, and incidental music for the theater. His most beloved work, Dido and Aeneas, was a product of this era. The Glorious Restoration of 1688 brought back Protestant monarchs, King William III and Queen Mary II, and Purcell could once again compose the sacred music that he loved. He had a close relationship with the king and queen, and wrote the funeral music as a tribute to Queen Mary after her death in 1694. Less than a year later, on November 21st, 1695, Purcell died unexpectedly of an infection. He was only 36 years old. His widow, Frances Purcell, was a relentless champion of her husband's work, and it is because of her efforts that Henry Purcell is remembered today as one of the greatest composers in English history. In response to the question, who is England's greatest composer, music critic Ivan Hewitt answers as follows. Britten and Elgar have their fans, but many say Vaughan Williams is greater than either, and still others would vote for one of our great Renaissance composers, such as Thomas Tallis or William Byrd. For me, it's none of these. It's a workaholic Londoner born 350 years ago who had a talent as wondrous as Mozart's and, like him, died at the cruelly young age of 36. Funeral music for Queen Mary, originally called funeral sentences, was first written for a small ensemble, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass singers, 4 trumpets, and accompaniment. It was performed at the funeral of the Queen herself, and soon after, the funeral of the composer. In 1995, Los Angeles Philharmonic, under the direction of Esa-Pekka Salonen, composed a piece to showcase their fantastic wind and percussion sections. The orchestra's resident composer, Stephen Stuckey, wrote this arrangement of the funeral music. Stuckey, an American composer, had already built an extremely successful career, writing celebrated music for chamber groups, orchestras, and concert bands. Throughout the piece, he masterfully balances 2 compositional voices, the elegant and expressive Baroque style of Henry Purcell and the modernist, exciting, percussive style of Stephen Stuckey. Stuckey, in the score, doesn't use the word arrange. Instead, he credits the work as composed by Henry Purcell, transcribed and elaborated by Stephen Stuckey. Instead of a traditional wind ensemble, funeral music for Queen Mary is written for a small collection of wind and percussion instruments. For the wind parts, Stuckey uses the wind section of the symphony orchestra. In addition, the piece calls for timpani, 2 percussionists, a piano, and a harp. The piece is divided into 4 movements. 1, the march, 2, anthem, 3, canzona, and 4, march. The first and last movements are almost identical, and they both follow the traditional passacaglia pattern. A passacaglia is a musical piece revolving around a repeating bass pattern. In this case, the pattern is as follows. Other famous Passacalias include the Passacaglia and Fugue in C minor by Bach, and the first movement of Holst's Suite in E-flat for military band. Henry Purcell was quite fond of this form, using it in many other compositions. Purcell's most famous piece, the Lament from Dido and Aeneas, is also a Passacaglia. In Funeral Music for Queen Mary, Purcell uses this form to gradually build intensity. Each time the Passacaglia bass pattern is used, the volume and the number of instruments both increase, leading to a powerful climax featuring the percussion section. The second movement is the anthem, which is a form of traditional hymn from the Anglican Church. The beginning of the anthem features a beautiful melody in a canonic structure. In a canon, the voices enter one after another, playing the same melody, layering on top of each other to create a rich musical texture. After the canon, Purcell makes use of the chromatic scale to reflect the sorrow-filled lyrics, which in the original read as follows. In the midst of life we are in death. Of whom may we seek for succor, but of thee, O Lord, who for our sins art justly displeased. Yet, O Lord most mighty, O holy and most merciful Savior, deliver us not into the bitter pains of eternal death. This is a technique called text painting, in which the composer uses musical effects to mimic the emotions and topics of the lyrics. While the original instrumentation was limited, Stuckey uses this movement as an opportunity to showcase the lush wind ensemble. Listen for the alternation of brass and woodwind choirs, which let every instrument's unique color shine through. Three, Canzona. The first two movements are fairly faithful to Purcell's original score. In the third movement, Stuckey takes control, injecting the sounds of the 21st century into this 17th century piece. Stuckey orchestrates the melody 4 times, creating 4 vastly different variations on the same material. The movement begins with a fairly standard setting of the original melody. Stuckey passes the melody around different instruments seamlessly. This technique, called Klangfarbenmelodie, or tone color melody, was very popular with experimental composers of the 1920s and 30s. After this, the woodwinds take over the main theme. In the background, Stuckey uses a unique way to develop the harmony in the ensemble. As the melody plays, the ensemble holds out every note for the entire phrase. This builds an incredibly dissonant cluster chord. In this way, Stuckey is honoring the original melody while inserting his own modern tastes. Following the woodwinds, the brass takes over the melody, building up a rich musical texture. The woodwinds return, but the melody soon devolves into short fragments, while the percussion colors the sound with mysterious, ethereal chords. In this hazy musical texture, a soft trombone chorale begins to play the theme from the first movement, while the timpani provide an ominous marching rhythm. It's barely audible at first, but soon takes over the entire ensemble. At the climax of this chorale, the music arrives without a break into the fourth movement. The fourth movement is almost identical to the first, increasing the instrumentation to be even more impactful. The timpani and bass drum provide thundering blows that take the piece to a powerful conclusion. This displays the gut-wrenching grief that Henry Purcell experienced at the death of Queen Mary. I'm here with Director of Bands at IU, Stephen W. Pratt. Thanks for joining us again.
Glad to be here.
And today we're talking about funeral music for Queen Mary by Henry Purcell, transcribed and elaborated by Stephen Stuckey. And my first question is always, why did you choose this piece? Why did you choose to program it?
Well, we arrived at this from several routes. One is that the concert is in our hall, which is a fantastic acoustical space, but very different from the Musical Arts Center. And so when choosing programming, you try to choose music that will naturally fit into our hall without compromise. It's a smaller hall, and because of the nature of the acoustics, a large ensemble can be effective, but within certain reasonable limits, and smaller ensembles are wonderfully enhanced. So therefore, this concert is built on any number of pieces that are arrived from various sections of the wind ensemble. So we open up with a Richard Strauss fantastic brass piece, which is a wonderful start featuring the trumpets, trombones, horns, tubas, etc. And then followed by a woodwind-centric piece, an octet of flutes, oboes, clarinets, and bassoons called Rossiniana, which is obviously based on the music of Rossini. And so funeral music for Queen Mary, after Henry Purcell, fits into that category pretty well. That's number one. It fits. It works within that acoustic. In fact, I think will actually be fabulous in that acoustic. Secondly, it's a piece that has really become important in the repertoire beyond what you would think, because it's a piece by Henry Purcell, the great English composer. In fact, for centuries, maybe the only great English composer before we get to Elgar and even Vaughan Williams Holst and Benjamin Britten. But we probably wouldn't necessarily do it if it was just because of Henry Purcell, but it works out. But Stephen Stuckey, who was a very prominent contemporary composer, tragically died of brain cancer just last year. But when he was affiliated in any number of ways with the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and the conductor at that time, Esa-Pekka Salonen, had suggested to him that he would like to have something that the LA Philharmonic could do with the music of Henry Purcell. And when a conductor of that notoriety suggests that he would like to have something, you do it. And Stephen Stuckey then put together a piece which really has become problematic for putting together programs, because half of the people who do this piece list it as a composition by Stephen Stuckey, based on the music of Henry Purcell, and the other half listed as the music of Henry Purcell as arranged, and then we use the word elaborated,
Yeah.
because it's more than just the music of Henry Purcell, although it is the music of Henry Purcell. So therefore, it seems to exist somewhere in between the two worlds. And the audience will hear this, in that it opens up with the obvious funeral music, and any number of themes that are then placed in to the whole piece, one after the other. But then you get into several sections where suddenly you begin to realize that the 21st century has intruded in a way that works. But so all of a sudden there are crescendos, and there are sforzandos, and there are trills, and there are the kinds of things that you would only use with 21st century music, but within the context of the music of Henry Purcell. And it gets to be more and more elaborate, and all of a sudden you hear basically the trombones bringing back the Purcell theme, although very syncopated, but you can hear it, and it closes the way it opens then with the funeral music of Queen Mary. And you can tell it's funeral music because it's slow and dramatic and not necessarily triumphant until the last three measures, when suddenly the first trombone makes it a major chord. And so there we are. But it is a very interesting composition that is done equally now by wind ensembles and major symphony orchestras, because it fits everybody's needs for the repertoire. So I'm really pleased that we were able to get it onto this program. I've been wanting to do it for several years, and the chance to do it in our hall makes it very special.
Absolutely. You mentioned the outer movements, the two marches, and they are really almost identical. I mean, maybe 4 or 5 notes different throughout. As a conductor, do you approach those as 2 repetitions of the same material, or do you approach those as 2 different animals that just happen to have the same material?
Well, the second time that it all appears is the way I approach it is it needs to be more climactic, and therefore more noble, somehow more dignified, and yet more volume. And so I think that anytime you have repetition in music, if you repeat it in exactly the same way, it's less interesting musically. So even though the audience may or may not perceive that it's the same music almost entirely, hopefully they'll see it as not redundant, but still fresh and leading us home, which is that's the goal, always the goal.
Absolutely. Now, the wind ensemble in general is such a forward-looking medium. I mean, we are so focused on commissions and encouraging new composers, and there are so many composition prizes for wind ensembles. And this is music where major elements of it are from 1695. I mean, this is a very, very old piece in a lot of ways. Do you think it's important for wind ensembles to be performing music from those eras?
Yeah, and actually, even to the broader question, so much of our material could be traced. We have elements of material that goes all the way back, but basically a lot of what we play and have available to us for original compositions is post-1950. And a lot of compositions brought forward in the 1960s and in the 1970s. Then in 1980, and leading to now, there was just a huge number of compositions that have been produced through commissions, and through consortiums of ensembles getting together to encourage composers, to the place where the wind ensemble quite often is the hero to the composer, who is searching for a group that will not only perform their music but actually rehearse it and perform it and bring it to life. The challenge, though, is to develop basic repertoire that we repeat, because if you play only things that are brand new, a repertoire is never developed. So we play the late symphonies of Haydn because we've continued to play them over and over and over again, and they are now firmly lodged in the repertoire. We don't do as much with Ditters von Dittersdorf because that music has not been firmly lodged into the repertoire. And so those of us who conduct, we have to be aware that the repertoire we choose, when repeated, will become part of the repertoire. So there are any number of works that have been composed in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 21st century that have been performed once and will never be performed again because no one else knows about them. But the ones that are repeated over and over again are the ones that will enter the repertoire. So that's one item we have to constantly remember. The second thing is that if we're having a meal, we have preliminaries to the meal, we have the main course, we have the dessert, et cetera, et cetera. There's variety. And if you have an all 21st century program, you don't have variety in terms of a musical way for the audience, but also the content for the players. And so by doing music of the past that works, and doing music of the recent past that works, and doing music of the current time, and putting that all together, you get a more broad palette musically. And so I think it's really important, particularly for the players in the wind ensemble, but with any group, that you have a variety of repertoire so that you can go back and touch various elements of music history as it goes along. And often we can do that without relying on transcriptions. And when we can do that without relying on transcriptions, then that's great. Other times, the transcriptions are very, very good and very close. Like we can play music of Susato, Tilman Susato, that who really was composing for massed winds and brass, although somewhat different instruments than what we have now. So the transcription is basically for 21st century model instruments. And let's do that. Let's increase the variety while we can. In chamber music, we feel very good about doing the Mozart Serenade in C minor, the Mozart Serenade in E flat, the Dvorak Serenade in D minor, bringing works of genius composers to our concerts. So anything that we can do to expand the repertoire, to have variety for the audience and for the players, is something that we try to do and should do. I'm not sure if that answers your question. But
absolutely. Okay, one final thought. I always love to ask, what's your favorite moment in the piece or favorite aspect of the piece? What just shimmers for you?
In some ways, the transformation from the very beginning, which is sort of like a heartbeat. Boom. Boom. And you imagine this is maybe Queen Mary near the end. Mm-hmm. And then there's this funeral, this dirge. You can sort of see the ceremonial transfer of the body to the wherever she's buried or whatever. And then you seem to have like elements maybe of her life, perhaps, some dance, some singing, some whatever. And then when it comes back together and it ends in the most glorious way, as only the English can have these great ceremonies of pomp and circumstance, it's a really good time for that. And so I enjoy that transformation from the beginning of the depth to of the death to the ending of the great ceremony, where you can just imagine that all the dignitaries are there in the court in their robes and that kind of thing, and honoring this queen of such a legacy. So that's sort of one of my favorite parts of this piece.
Absolutely. Well, thanks again for coming in. I think we're all looking forward to hearing this. This is November 7th in our hall at 8 p.m.
That's
Is that
correct.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Thank you again.
Right. Thank you.
Well, that's it for today's episode of Settling the Score. Production by Becca Kroniak, Alex McGill, Nathan Heed, and myself, Jackson McClellan. Recording and editing done by Big Bill Wilkinson. Thanks to Kappa Kappa Psi, the Department of Bands at IU, and Mr. Stephen W. Pratt for their help. The IU Wind Ensemble will be performing a terrific program, including funeral music for Queen Mary, on November 7th at 8 p.m. in our hall. We can't wait to see you there, and we can't wait for you to hear it.